A peaceful afternoon takes a dark turn when a well-respected veteran stumbles upon an all-too-familiar scene of abuse. But this time, standing by isn't an option, because the victim is no ordinary man, and his story will shake the very foundations of justice. In broad daylight, a decorated black veteran is brutally assaulted by a police officer who assumes, like so many times before, that his actions will go unnoticed. But this time, he's wrong. What the officer doesn't realize is that the man he left in a coma has a son who could expose the corruption that runs deep within the system. This is a powerful story of civil rights, corruption, and an unyielding fight for justice reform that will send shockwaves through the community. Before we dive into this gripping tale, let us know where you're watching from. And if justice and accountability matter to you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this. The late afternoon sun cast golden rays, stretching long shadows across the small southern town as John Jack Carter strolled through the streets he knew so well. At 68, Jack's pace had slowed with age, but his posture remained firm and his presence still commanded respect. Everyone knew Jack, a Vietnam veteran, a man who had quietly served his country and his community. That day had been like many others. Jack had spent a few hours at the local Veterans Hall, catching up with old friends over coffee, reminiscing about stories from years gone by. It had been a peaceful afternoon, just the kind Jack preferred. But as he crossed the town square, something unusual caught his eye. His gaze fixed on a scene unfolding across the park. Jack squinted, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. There, in the middle of the commotion, stood Officer Roy McDougal, his large frame looming over a young man who looked cornered and anxious. Jack recognized Roy instantly. He had a reputation, a cop known for escalating situations rather than calming them down. Roy had been on the force for years, and his aggressive tactics were well known, especially towards those who didn't fit his narrow mold of belonging. The young man, barely out of his teenage years, stood tense, his hands shaking as he nervously fumbled with something in his pockets. Jack couldn't make out the words being exchanged, but he saw the fear in the boy's eyes, and the thick tension in the air was unmistakable. A small crowd had gathered nearby, but they were frozen, unsure whether to step in or pretend they hadn't seen anything at all. With a heavy sigh, Jack started walking towards them. His gut told him that something was about to go very wrong. As he approached, he spoke in a calm, measured voice. "Is everything all right here, officer?" Roy's head jerked in Jack's direction, his eyes narrowing as he glared at the older man. "This is none of your business, Carter," Roy snapped, his tone sharp and dismissive. But Jack wasn't backing down. Not today. A simple intervention to protect a young man spirals into something far more dangerous. Jack Carter, a man who's faced battles both abroad and at home, now finds himself in a standoff that could change the course of his life and the town's history. Jack ignored Roy's harsh tone, his focus shifting to the young man, who looked more frightened than defiant. The boy's hands shook as he finally pulled out an ID, offering it to Roy with visible anxiety. Without even a proper glance, Roy snatched it from him and shoved it carelessly into his own pocket. "I'm just passing through," Jack said calmly, keeping his voice even. "Doesn't seem like the boy's causing any trouble." Roy's eyes darkened as his jaw clenched, clearly irked by Jack's presence. Jack wasn't just confronting an officer with a quick temper, he was facing someone looking for any excuse to let his inner rage explode. "I told you, this is none of your concern," Roy growled, stepping closer to Jack, as if his sheer size would be enough to force submission. But Jack wasn't easily intimidated. He had faced down worse than an angry cop in his lifetime, and he wasn't about to flinch now. "I've seen situations like this before," Jack replied, his voice calm but resolute, "and I know when things are about to go bad." Roy bristled, his face flushed with anger. The crowd around them watched uncomfortably, sensing the tension rise like a storm ready to break. Roy, usually the one in control, was feeling the weight of eyes on him, and Jack's steady defiance was making him lose grip of that control. Jack stood firm, his gaze unwavering. "No need for this to turn violent," he said, his voice measured. "Let the boy go. He hasn't done anything wrong." That was it. Roy's face twisted with rage, and in a flash he shoved Jack hard, sending him stumbling back. The crowd gasped in shock, startled by the sudden violence. Jack managed to catch himself, straightening slowly, his joints aching but his spirit unyielding. Years of discipline and patience urged him to walk away, to let it go. But Jack Carter wasn't a man who backed down. Not when he knew something was deeply wrong. In a flash, a moment of courage turns into a life-altering encounter. One man's stand against injustice leads to violence, and the consequences will echo far beyond this small town. But Jack's conscience wouldn't let him walk away. He knew when it was time to stand firm, and this was one of those moments. "You need to back off, officer," Jack said quietly, his voice low yet heavy with the resolve of someone unafraid of confrontation. Roy, however, wasn't listening anymore. His fists were clenched, his body rigid with anger. Without warning, he swung, his fist connecting squarely with Jack's face. The force of the blow sent Jack stumbling back, and he crumpled to the ground. His head struck the pavement with a sickening crack. The crowd, paralyzed with shock, watched in horror as blood began to pool beneath Jack's head. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Then chaos erupted. People rushed forward to help Jack, while others pulled out their phones, recording the shocking scene. Roy's face turned pale, breathless from the sudden explosion of violence. He stepped back, his mind racing, as he tried to figure out how to salvage the situation. Grabbing his radio, he barked for backup, his voice trembling. He knew he had to get ahead of this, twist the story to make it seem like Jack had been the aggressor. His heart pounded as he spun the narrative in his mind, already crafting his defense. But what Roy didn't realize was that his actions had ignited something far beyond his control. The scene unfolded quickly. Jack lay motionless on the ground, his face pale, blood trickling from a gash on the back of his head where it had hit the pavement. Once strong and commanding, his body now appeared fragile and lifeless. A few bystanders rushed to his side, kneeling beside him, while others stood frozen in shock, still processing what they had just witnessed. "Someone call an ambulance," a woman shouted, her voice trembling with panic. The young man at the center of the confrontation remained rooted to the spot, his eyes wide with terror. He glanced at Officer Roy McDougal, who now looked visibly shaken. Roy's chest heaved as he breathed rapidly, his fists still clenched at his sides, ready for another blow. The aggression that had fueled him moments before began to morph into something colder, more calculated. In the wake of chaos, the truth struggles to surface amid deception and fear. As the dust settles, one officer's actions invite scrutiny, and a community demands accountability. Roy fumbled with his radio, barking into it for immediate backup, his voice uneven and betraying his panic. "We've got an injured suspect. Need medical assistance at the park," he said, trying to weave in the lie that might save him. He shot a glance at the small crowd gathering around Jack, straightening his posture in a futile attempt to regain control of the situation, but it was already slipping from his grasp. One by one, bystanders raised their phones, capturing the moment. The still body of Jack Carter, a decorated veteran, lying on the ground, and the officer responsible standing over him, looking pale and shaken. It was a scene that would soon spread far beyond this small park. The wail of sirens cut through the tension as the ambulance arrived, paramedics rushing out to kneel by Jack's side. One of them, a younger man with urgency in his eyes, quickly checked Jack's pulse. "Got a pulse, but he's in bad shape," the paramedic muttered to his partner. "Head injury, possible trauma to the brain. We need to get him out of here now." Carefully, they lifted Jack onto a stretcher, his body limp as they worked to stabilize him. The crowd murmured in hushed tones, disbelief etched on their faces. Jack was someone they all knew, respected, even admired. To see him laid out like this, witnessing the brutality of it all, was nearly impossible to process. As the paramedics wheeled Jack toward the ambulance, his breathing was shallow, a thin tube now feeding him oxygen as they worked quickly. Just before they closed the ambulance doors, someone asked, "Will he be okay?" The paramedic's answer was grim. "I don't know." The ambulance sped away, its sirens fading into the distance, but the tension in the air lingered, thick and suffocating. Officer Roy stood alone now, the crowd watching him in silence. His initial panic had faded, replaced by a cold, rigid determination. He could feel the weight of their stares, the unspoken judgment in their eyes. His hand twitched toward his holster, but he stopped himself. He wasn't in control anymore. Suddenly, a man from the crowd stepped forward, his voice calm but loud enough for everyone to hear. That wasn't self-defense, Roy. In a moment of reckoning, the truth comes crashing down. As accusations begin to fly, one officer finds himself caught in a web of lies, and the world watches in disbelief. We all saw what you did. Roy's eyes darted to the man, then quickly to the rest of the crowd. The quiet murmurs grew louder, each word a brick in the wall of accusation. Though no one was brave enough to voice their thoughts fully yet, the tension hung heavy in the air. Back off. Roy barked, trying to assert his authority, but he was only interfering in police business now, and his words carried no weight. Not anymore. The crowd wasn't listening to him, and the phones continued to record, capturing every moment. Whatever power he had moments ago was slipping through his fingers. His stomach twisted as he realized how quickly this could spiral out of control. Turning his back to them, he paced in short, agitated steps, already plotting his next move. He needed to get his story straight before backup arrived, before more officers saw what had really happened. Minutes later, when the police chief arrived on the scene, Roy was quick to speak first. "It got out of hand, Chief," he said, keeping his voice low. "The guy stepped in while I was questioning the kid. He got aggressive. I had no choice but to defend myself." The police chief, a grizzled man with more years on the force than most, stared at Roy for a long moment. His gaze flickered to the bloodstain on the pavement where Jack had fallen, then to the group of onlookers still gathered around. The chief sensed that the situation was already spiraling beyond their control. "I don't care what your story is, McDougal," the chief said, his voice grave and low enough that only Roy could hear. "This is going to be a mess, and you'd better hope your version sticks." He turned and gestured to one of the other officers who had just arrived. "Clear the area," he ordered, his tone firm. Roy swallowed hard, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. He had faced tight situations before, but this was different. This wasn't just a petty arrest gone wrong. This was something much bigger. And the longer he stood there, the more he realized just how badly he had miscalculated. Later that evening, word of the incident spread like wildfire. By the time the local news picked it up, clips of the confrontation were already circulating on social media, igniting outrage and calls for justice. In the age of social media, the truth cannot be hidden. As videos of brutality go viral, a community unites for justice, igniting a firestorm of outrage that will change everything. The videos didn't lie. People could see Jack stepping in calmly, trying to defuse the situation, only to be brutally assaulted by Roy. Public outrage came swiftly. Residents gathered in the town square, demanding answers. "Justice for Jack." Signs were hastily scribbled on cardboard as protesters called for Roy's immediate suspension. The story of an honorable veteran being attacked in broad daylight resonated deeply, striking a chord with everyone. Whispers of police brutality, something many had feared but never dared to speak aloud, grew into full-blown cries of injustice. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Jack's condition worsened. Doctors worked tirelessly to relieve the swelling in his brain, but they offered no guarantees. He had slipped into a coma, his body unresponsive, and the prognosis was uncertain. What was once a hospital room for recovery had turned into a waiting room for life-altering news. Outside, a small crowd gathered, friends and family of Jack standing vigil, praying for his recovery. Among them were fellow veterans, men who had once served alongside Jack or knew him from the local hall. Their faces were etched with quiet rage, sadness, and disbelief. As night fell, the tension in the air thickened, and people began to realize something terrible. This wouldn't be easily forgotten. Jack Carter, the man they all respected, lay between life and death, and the town had reached a boiling point. It was early evening when Michael Carter's phone buzzed, pulling his attention from the documents scattered across his desk. In his office, the walls were lined with accolades and degrees, a testament to the journey that had brought him to this position. As the state attorney general, Michael was used to receiving calls at all hours, calls about cases, political issues, or civil rights violations demanding his attention. But this call was different. He picked up the phone, not recognizing the number. "Carter," he said, his voice brisk and professional. The voice on the other end was shaky. "Mr. Carter, I don't know how to say this, but it's about your father." Michael's pulse quickened. "My father?" he asked, his calm exterior beginning to crack. A family man's worst nightmare becomes a call to action. As the truth unfolds, a son prepares to challenge a system built on silence and injustice. "What happened?" Michael asked, urgency creeping into his voice. The woman on the other end explained quickly, her words tumbling over one another. "There was an incident. He was hurt badly. He's at the hospital in a coma. It was a police officer. There was an altercation in the park. You should get here." The words slammed into Michael like a freight train. His father, Jack Carter, the man who had always been a pillar of strength, who had survived war and years of hard work, was now lying in a hospital bed, unconscious and barely clinging to life. For a moment, Michael didn't move, his mind struggling to process the enormity of what he'd just been told. His father had been hurt by a cop? In a coma? "Are you there, Mr. Carter?" the voice on the phone asked, hesitant. "I'm here," Michael replied, his voice now low and steady. "I'm coming." He ended the call, his hand trembling slightly as he placed the phone back on his desk. Michael sat there for a long moment, his thoughts racing. He understood the implications. His father had been injured not by some random accident, but by the very people sworn to protect him. And now, lying in a hospital bed, he might never wake up. But the full gravity of the situation hadn't even hit him yet. That officer, whoever he was, had no idea who Jack's son was. He had no idea that the man he'd put in the hospital was the father of the state's top law enforcement official, a man who had dedicated his life to fighting for justice and accountability. Michael stood abruptly, pulling on his jacket, his mind shifting into action mode. He had seen this kind of thing before, cases of police misconduct, cover-ups, attempts to brush aside the truth. But this time it wasn't just any case. This time, it was personal. His office, sleek and professional, felt too quiet now, like the calm before a storm. This officer had no idea what he had set in motion. Michael wasn't coming as just another concerned family member. He was coming as the Attorney General, a man with the power to dismantle a corrupt system and expose every lie, every injustice. He grabbed his briefcase and headed out the door. He would stop by the hospital first to see his father. But after that, he would ensure that every officer involved, every person who had stood by and done nothing, would pay the price. As night falls, a son grapples with the weight of injustice and the determination to fight back. The battle for truth is about to begin. It was nearly nightfall when Michael arrived at the hospital. His mind raced, but his face remained a mask of calm control. Years of legal battles and public service had taught him to compartmentalize his emotions, to push them down until it was time to act. But seeing his father, Jack Carter, the man who had raised him, the one who taught him to fight for what was right, lying unconscious on a hospital bed, tubes running from his arms and his face pale and still, was almost too much to bear. Michael stood at the edge of the room, hands clenched into fists at his sides. His father looked so small, so fragile. The machines filled the silence, each beep of the monitor like a ticking clock, counting down the moments left to make things right. A nurse entered quietly, her face somber. "He's stable for now, but the head injury." She trailed off, searching for the right words. "It's serious. We're doing everything we can." Michael nodded, his eyes never leaving his father's face. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough but controlled. She offered a sad smile and slipped out, leaving Michael alone with his thoughts. For a moment, all he could hear was the rhythmic beeping of the machines, his mind replaying the words from the phone. Police officer, altercation, coma. A cop did this, and now that cop would face the full force of justice. Michael exhaled sharply, feeling his anger burn hotter beneath the surface. His father, a man who had served his country with dignity, was lying in a hospital bed because of someone sworn to protect, not harm. The hypocrisy was suffocating. But Michael wouldn't let his emotions take over. There was work to do. The town buzzed with activity by the time Michael stepped outside the hospital. News of the incident had spread fast, and protests were already forming. A large crowd had gathered outside the police station, demanding answers and holding signs with Jack's name scrawled on them. Michael had anticipated this. The videos of the attack had gone viral, and the entire state was watching. A son is determined to seek justice for his father. But the fight against corruption and a broken system is just beginning. Michael's face was familiar to many in the crowd. He was no stranger to the public eye, but now his presence carried a different weight. The reporters waiting outside the hospital recognized him immediately, their voices rising with questions. A few reporters pushed forward, cameras capturing every movement. "Mr. Carter, can you comment on your father's condition? Do you have any response to the officer's actions?" Michael straightened, his voice cutting through the chaos with calm authority. "My father is in critical condition," he stated, his tone measured, though the anger beneath it was unmistakable. "There will be a full investigation, and I won't rest until the truth is exposed and justice is served." The crowd quieted, the reporters scribbling notes as cameras rolled, capturing the weight of Michael's words. Without another word, he turned and walked toward his car. His legal team had already been alerted and were assembling evidence as he prepared to confront the system that had allowed this to happen. The officer who had put his father in that hospital bed had no idea what was coming. The next morning, the air in the town felt heavier. Jack's face, a man known and respected for his service, was splashed across news networks, and the image of him lying unconscious in the park had become a symbol of something much larger. But for Michael Carter, this wasn't just about symbols or headlines. This was his father. The weight of that fact pressed heavily on him as he sat in his office. His team gathered around him, reviewing the evidence collected so far. He had been up all night, poring over every detail, witness statements, footage of the attack, and reports filed by the police department. The picture was becoming clearer, and it wasn't pretty. Officer Roy McDougal had used excessive force, and now his father was in a coma because of it. But it wasn't just about McDougal. Michael knew that the problem ran deeper. "Roy's been a problem for a long time," Michael's legal advisor said, flipping through McDougal's personnel file, which had been sent over by a whistleblower inside the department. Multiple complaints of excessive force, harassment, racial bias, all swept under the rug. He's been protected. As the truth begins to unravel, one man's violent actions put an entire police department under scrutiny, igniting a fierce fight for justice. Michael's jaw tightened. "How far back do the complaints go?" "Years," the advisor replied. "Most of them never even made it to the review board, but now, with the video evidence and the public outcry, they won't be able to cover it up this time." Michael nodded, absorbing the information. This wasn't just about one officer anymore. This was about the department's culture of protectionism, the way they'd allowed officers like McDougal to operate without consequence for far too long. He glanced at the footage of the attack once more, the image of Roy punching his father playing out in slow motion on the screen in front of him. The blow, the fall, the blood pooling beneath Jack's head. It was a sight he would never forget. "We'll press charges against McDougal," Michael said, his voice steady. "But we're not stopping there. I want a full investigation into the department's handling of his complaints. If there is corruption, we'll expose it, and anyone who covered for him is going down with him." His team nodded in agreement. They knew Michael wasn't one to pull punches when it came to justice. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Roy McDougal was sitting in the police station, his nerves frayed as he watched the fallout from the incident unfold. The news reports were relentless, his name plastered across the headlines, and his actions being dissected by every media outlet in the state. The town was in an uproar, and protesters had gathered outside the station, calling for his arrest. Roy was no stranger to trouble, but this was different. This was spiraling out of control. "Roy, you've got to lay low for a while," the police chief said, pacing back and forth in front of him. "This is turning into a shitstorm. The state attorney general is on this. Michael Carter's his son, for God's sake." In a world where justice is often obscured, one man's resolve to hold the system accountable ignites a fire that cannot be extinguished. "How was I supposed to know?" Roy snapped, panic creeping into his voice. He didn't say anything. He just stepped in, and "You think that's going to matter?" The chief cut him off, frustration evident in his tone. "You think anyone's going to care what he said or didn't say? There are videos, Roy. People saw what you did." Roy sat back in his chair, rubbing his forehead with the palm of his hand. He could feel the walls closing in, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had screwed up badly, and now there was nowhere to hide. The chief sighed, leaning against the desk, arms crossed. "We'll do what we can to protect you, but if Carter's involved..." He trailed off, leaving the rest of the sentence unsaid. If Michael Carter was leading the investigation, there would be no protection. The chief knew it, and so did Roy. That afternoon, Michael held his first press conference in front of the courthouse, standing tall as the cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions from the crowd. His face was calm, composed, but there was a fire in his eyes that everyone could see. "I want to be clear," Michael began, his voice firm and measured. "We will be conducting a full investigation into the events that took place in the park and the actions of Officer Roy McDougal. There will be no cover-ups, no protection for those responsible. Justice will be served." The crowd of reporters fell silent, their pens scratching furiously across notepads. Michael's reputation preceded him. He was known for his zero-tolerance approach to corruption, and now, with his father lying in a hospital bed, no one doubted that he would pursue this case with unrelenting force. "We will be pressing charges against Officer McDougal for the assault on my father, Jack Carter," Michael continued. "But this investigation will go beyond just the actions of one officer. We are looking into the police department's handling of prior complaints against Officer McDougal, and we will ensure that any misconduct within the department is brought to light." Michael didn't raise his voice, but the gravity of his words hung in the air like a storm cloud. There was no question about his resolve. He wasn't just coming after McDougal. Michael's heart sank. He braced himself for the worst as he leaned back in his chair, listening intently. "What did you find?" The investigator's voice was steady, but Michael could hear the gravity behind it. "Not only does McDougal have multiple complaints for excessive force, but we've also uncovered a pattern of harassment. There are records of him intimidating witnesses and fellow officers who dared to speak out. It seems he's been operating under the radar for years." Michael clenched his fists. That makes sense. He's always had a chip on his shoulder. But to think he's been getting away with this, we need everything documented. "Absolutely. We're compiling all the evidence now. But I need to warn you. This could blow back on the department. They're going to fight to protect their own." "Let them," Michael replied, his voice cold and resolute. "We're not backing down. This isn't just about McDougal. It's about accountability for everyone involved." After hanging up, Michael stared at the files scattered across his desk, each one representing another layer of deceit and failure within the system. He had a decision to make. This wasn't just a case. It was a war against a culture that had protected the very people who were supposed to serve and protect. Michael stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the gathering crowd of protesters. Their chants resonated with him, a reminder of the community's anger and pain. Jack's situation had become a rallying point for those who felt oppressed, and now their voices echoed with his own desire for justice. As he turned back to his desk, he pulled out a blank notepad and started jotting down his plan. He would need a public strategy that would keep the pressure on. Transparency was essential. He would hold press conferences, release statements, and utilize social media to keep the public informed of every step they were taking. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. It was his legal advisor, a seasoned attorney with years of experience in high-stakes cases. "Michael, we need to talk about the next steps. The public wants answers, and we need to be prepared for a possible backlash from the department." "I know. I want a full press briefing scheduled for tomorrow. We'll share everything we've uncovered so far. The people deserve to know the truth about what's been happening in this department." His advisor nodded, impressed with Michael's tenacity. "We can also leverage community support. If we get local leaders involved, it might help maintain public pressure on the police." "Agreed. I want to meet with community leaders and organize a town hall. This isn't just about my father anymore. It's about everyone who's been failed by this system." "Are you sure you want to go that route? It could escalate tensions further." Michael turned to face his advisor, determination etched on his face. "I'm sure. If we don't address the community's concerns head-on, we risk losing their trust. We have to be transparent and show that we're committed to real change. Then let's make it happen, the advisor said, his confidence in Michael's leadership evident. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the city, Michael felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was a fight worth having, and he was prepared to see it through to the end. With every piece of evidence and every public statement, he would build a case not just for his father, but for justice that had been denied to too many for far too long. Meanwhile, Roy sat in his apartment, a sense of dread settling in. The walls felt like they were closing in, and the weight of his actions pressed down on him like a vice. He could hear the chants from the protests outside, the anger of the community boiling over. As he scrolled through social media, the hashtags Justice for Jack and Carter versus Corruption flooded his feed. It was only a matter of time before the storm reached his doorstep. Desperate for a way out, Roy picked up his phone and dialed his lawyer. "We need to talk," he said, his voice trembling with fear. "I can't go to prison. I need a deal." The walls felt like they were closing in around him as he listened to the chants of the protesters echoing outside. The phrase, "Justice for Jack," seemed to seep into every corner of his mind, reminding him of the monumental error he had made. He thought he could intimidate Jack, thought he could assert his authority without consequence. But now the consequences were crashing down on him like a tidal wave. The media was relentless, and the town was rising against him. Roy rubbed his temples, trying to stave off the rising tide of panic that threatened to swallow him whole. He reached for the bottle of whiskey on the table, pouring himself a generous glass. He knew he shouldn't drink. Not now, but it was the only thing that dulled the sharp edges of reality. The images of Jack falling to the ground, blood pooling beneath him, haunted his thoughts. He'd acted out of anger, out of desperation to maintain control, and now he had lost everything. As he sat there in the dim light of his apartment, Roy's phone buzzed, startling him. It was a text from a fellow officer. "You need to lay low. Things are getting messy. The AG's office is involved." He felt a cold sweat break out on his brow. The AG? He cursed under his breath, knowing full well the implications of Michael Carter getting involved. That meant the full force of the law was bearing down on him, and he had no way out. The chief had made it clear. He was on his own. Roy took a deep breath, forcing himself to think. Maybe he could spin this. Maybe he could argue that Jack had provoked him, that he was acting in self-defense. But deep down, he knew that the evidence was against him. The videos were damning, the public outrage was palpable, and he could feel the walls of his own little world crumbling. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door, jolting him from his thoughts. Panic surged through him as he grabbed the whiskey bottle and shoved it out of sight. Who could it be? He peered through the peephole, his heart racing. It was the chief, looking tense and grim. With a deep breath, Roy opened the door. The chief stepped inside, shutting the door behind him with an urgency that sent a chill down Roy's spine. "What the hell are you doing?" the chief demanded, his voice low but firm. "I'm laying low," Roy replied defensively, crossing his arms. "What do you want?" "The department is in chaos. You need to be ready for what's coming. The AG is serious about this. They're not just going to let it go." Roy's stomach dropped. "What do you mean? What are they going to do?" "The evidence is piling up, and Michael Carter won't rest until he has you in handcuffs," the chief said, his expression grave. "You need to get your story straight, and you need to prepare for the fallout. There are too many people who want you gone." Roy shook his head, trying to dismiss the chief's words, but doubt gnawed at him. "I didn't mean to hurt him. It was a mistake." "Doesn't matter," the chief shot back. "The public won't see it that way. They see a cop who attacked a veteran. You're a target now." Roy felt a surge of anger. "I can't just sit back and wait for them to come for me." "You don't have a choice," the chief replied, his voice hard. "You need to keep your head down and wait for this to blow over. Just hope it doesn't get any worse." With that, the chief turned and left, leaving Roy standing alone in his apartment, feeling the weight of impending doom settle heavily on his shoulders. The world outside was closing in, and there was nowhere to hide. Roy sank onto the couch, his head in his hands. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything was spiraling out of control, and deep down, he feared that the reckoning was just beginning. Tears welled in Michael's eyes as he spoke, the weight of his words almost too heavy to bear. He remembered the countless lessons his father had taught him, the importance of standing up for what was right, the value of integrity, and the strength of compassion. Those values now felt like a lifeline as he faced the storm brewing outside the hospital walls. The beeping of the machines and the sterile smell of antiseptics surrounded him, a stark contrast to the warm memories he held in his heart. Jack had been a rock in his life, a man who had faced challenges head-on and never backed down. Michael felt a deep-seated anger rise within him, not just at the officer who had hurt his father, but at the system that had allowed such brutality to flourish unchecked. He closed his eyes for a moment, drawing in a shaky breath. "I won't let them get away with this," he vowed, more to himself than to the comatose figure beside him. "I swear, I'll make them pay." As he sat there, Michael felt the weight of the world pressing down on him. But he also felt a renewed sense of purpose. He couldn't afford to break, not now. Jack needed him to be strong, to fight for justice, and to protect the values they both held dear. When Michael finally stood up to leave, he glanced back at his father. "I'll be back tomorrow. Keep fighting, Dad. We need you." Stepping out of the hospital, he was greeted by the sounds of chanting from the protesters gathered outside. The crowd had grown larger, their signs demanding accountability, justice, and change. It was a reminder that this fight was bigger than just his family. It was about the community, the principles of justice, and the future of policing. Michael's resolve hardened as he approached the gathered crowd, their energy palpable. He took a moment to absorb the scene, his heart swelling with pride at the solidarity displayed by the people of the town. As he stepped onto a makeshift stage to address them, the cheers of support washed over him. "Thank you all for being here today," Michael began, his voice steady and unwavering. "This isn't just about my father. This is about justice, about holding those who abuse their power accountable, and about ensuring that no one else has to endure what he has suffered. We have a long road ahead of us," he continued, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, "but together we can change the narrative. We can demand a police force that protects rather than harms. We can bring light to the darkness that has lurked within our community for too long." The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices uniting in a powerful chorus of support. In that moment, Michael felt a surge of hope, buoyed by the determination of those around him. This fight was just beginning, but they would stand together, and he would not back down. Back in his apartment, Roy McDougal paced nervously, his mind racing with dread. He replayed the lawyer's words, the notion of cutting a deal lingering heavily in his thoughts. Could he really do it? Could he betray his fellow officers to save himself? He felt trapped, cornered by his own choices. The reality of what he'd done was settling in, and the regret was suffocating. He had always believed he was above the law, that his badge afforded him protection. But now, that same badge felt like a noose tightening around his neck. His phone buzzed again, startling him from his thoughts. It was a text from a colleague. "We're meeting at the bar. You should come." For a moment, he considered it. Maybe the camaraderie could provide some comfort, a reminder of the life he once had. But deep down, he knew he couldn't face them, not with everything hanging in the balance. Not when the walls were closing in. Instead, he poured himself another glass of whiskey, staring blankly at the television, where news reporters continued to dissect the story. He was a man on the edge, and as the weight of his decisions settled heavily on him, he couldn't shake the feeling that the reckoning was drawing closer, and there would be no escape from the consequences of his actions. "Michael, you need to understand the complexities at play here," Chief Green said, his tone shifting to a defensive one. "It's not as simple as you think. Officers have a difficult job, and McDougal, he made a mistake, yes." "A mistake?" Michael shot back, his voice rising. "A mistake is spilling coffee on your shirt. What McDougal did was assault, plain and simple, and your department has a long history of ignoring this type of behavior. Multiple complaints filed against him, and you just turned a blind eye. You protected him." Green ran a hand through his thinning hair, frustration etched on his face. "We don't always have all the facts when these complaints come in. They're often one-sided, you know that. It takes time to investigate. We can't just act on hearsay. The last thing we need is a witch hunt. Michael took a step forward, leaning over the desk, his voice low but intense. This isn't about a witch hunt. This is about justice. This is about accountability. You know there's a pattern with McDougal, and you let it go unchecked. He couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom that hung over him like a storm cloud. The relentless coverage was suffocating, and the chants of "justice for Jack" echoed in his ears, a constant reminder of what he had done. His phone buzzed again, but this time he didn't have the energy to answer it. Instead, he let it ring out, the sound grating against his already frayed nerves. The longer he stayed in hiding, the more he felt like a cornered animal, waiting for the inevitable attack. His thoughts spiraled, replaying the moment that had changed everything, the moment he had lashed out in anger, the moment he had lost control. He could still see Jack's face, the shock in his eyes as he took the hit. It wasn't supposed to be like this. He was supposed to be a protector, a law enforcement officer committed to serving and safeguarding the community. But now, he was the villain in a narrative that seemed to have been written long before he had even thrown that punch. As the afternoon wore on, his mind was pulled in two directions: the instinct to hide from the fallout and the desperate urge to find a way to save himself. He reached for his phone, hesitating before dialing his lawyer's number. "Roy," his lawyer answered, and Roy could hear the tension in his voice. "We need to talk. I can't just sit here. I need to do something," Roy said, his voice shaky with panic. "What are my options? I can't go to prison for this." "You need to face the music, Roy. Cutting a deal might be your best bet. The evidence against you is overwhelming. If you cooperate and provide information about the department, about the culture of protection, you might get a lighter sentence," the lawyer said, his voice steady but urgent. Roy felt a wave of nausea wash over him. "You want me to throw my colleagues under the bus? You think I'd survive that?" "The alternative is facing charges alone, Roy. And believe me, the media is not on your side. You're already the enemy in the public's eyes. If you don't act now, you could be looking at years behind bars." The reality of his situation sank in deeper. He felt trapped, and the walls of his apartment seemed to close in on him even further. "What do you need from me?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Just be honest. I need everything you know about the complaints against you, how they were handled or mishandled. If we can prove that this was a systemic issue, it might give us leverage in negotiations. You may not be the only one going down for this." Roy sat in silence for a moment, contemplating his next move. If he spoke up, he'd be betraying the very badge he had worn with pride for so long. But if he didn't, he would lose everything he had worked for. "Okay," he finally said, his voice resolute despite the fear clawing at him. "I'll do it. But I need assurances. I can't be left hanging. I'll do what I can. But you need to understand, Roy, the moment you step into the light, you're no longer just a cop, you're a whistleblower, and that carries its own risks." "I understand," Roy said, his heart pounding. "I'll meet with you tomorrow to go over everything. Just make sure I'm safe. I don't want to be the one everyone blames when this blows up." As he hung up, Roy felt a mix of dread and relief wash over him. He had chosen a path that could either save him or destroy him. The reality of his choices hit him hard, and for the first time since the incident, he felt a flicker of hope. But it was accompanied by an equally potent fear of what lay ahead. Back at the hospital, Michael was preparing to meet with his team again. He had been relentless in his pursuit of justice, but the emotional toll of the situation weighed heavily on him. Each day, he was reminded of his father's strength, the man who had fought battles on foreign shores, and now lay silent in a hospital bed. As he entered the conference room, his team looked up, their expressions a mix of determination and fatigue. "We've got a lot of work ahead," Michael said, steeling himself. "McDougal is likely going to cooperate, and we need to prepare for everything he could reveal. This isn't just about getting justice for my father anymore. It's about exposing a culture of silence and protection that has gone unchecked for too long." His team nodded in agreement, the atmosphere charged with purpose. They were ready to fight, ready to uncover the truth, no matter how deep it ran. For Michael, the stakes were personal, but they were also a matter of principle. With each piece of evidence they uncovered, with every officer's name that came to light, he felt a renewed sense of resolve. His father was fighting for his life, and in that fight, Michael found his own purpose. The battle for justice had only just begun, and he wouldn't stop until the entire truth was exposed. Michael Carter had built a career on taking down men like him, officers who thought they could get away with abusing their power. And now, Michael had every reason in the world to come after him with everything he had. Roy's hands shook as he picked up his phone, scrolling through the endless barrage of news articles, each one worse than the last. They were digging into his past, pulling up every complaint, every incident where he had overstepped. It was all coming out now, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He thought about the punch, the way Jack had hit the ground, the way his head had cracked against the pavement. He hadn't meant for it to go that far. He had been angry, sure, but he hadn't meant to put the old man in a coma. But that didn't matter now. Intent didn't matter. The damage was done, and Roy knew that his time was running out. Back in his office, Michael Carter stood in front of the large window overlooking the courthouse square. Michael could feel the tide turning. The investigation was making progress. The pieces were falling into place, and soon, very soon, there would be nowhere for Roy McDougal or the corrupt officers who had protected him to hide. His phone buzzed. It was his lead investigator again. "We've got what we need," she said, her voice filled with satisfaction. "The chief is cooperating, and the files are coming in. We've uncovered more complaints against McDougal, racially motivated stops, excessive force reports, all buried. And it's not just him. This whole department is infected." Michael nodded, feeling a surge of grim satisfaction. "Good. Keep digging. We're going to tear this whole thing down." He ended the call, his gaze still focused on the protesters below. The town was on the verge of something big, something that would change it forever, and Michael was ready to lead the charge. The courthouse was swarming with reporters and protesters, their voices blending into a single roar as they crowded around the steps. The town was on edge, waiting for one thing: the arrest of Officer Roy McDougal. Inside, Michael Carter sat at a table surrounded by his legal team, their faces calm and focused. The moment they had been building toward was finally here. After weeks of investigation, after uncovering every lie, every buried report, every complaint against Roy McDougal, they were ready to bring him to justice. Michael glanced at the thick stack of papers in front of him. The indictment. It had taken days of careful review, but the charges were set: assault, misconduct, and a history of racially biased behavior that had been ignored by the police department for years. The evidence was overwhelming, and there was no longer any doubt that Roy would face the full weight of the law. The door to the room opened, and Michael's lead investigator walked in, her expression tense but determined. "It's time," she said. Michael nodded, rising to his feet. He'd been waiting for this moment, waiting for the chance to hold Roy accountable for what he had done to his father. But as he walked toward the courtroom, there was a part of him that still felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about Roy McDougal anymore. This was about a broken system. A system that had failed his father and so many others like him. As Officer Roy McDougal was led toward the courthouse, flanked by officers, the crowd erupted into boos and shouts. The sight of him, his once cocky demeanor replaced by the pale, haunted look of a man whose world was crumbling, only fueled the anger of the protesters. Roy kept his head down, his shoulders hunched, but the weight of the public's fury bore down on him like a physical force. He could hear the chants and feel the stares burning into him. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. He had thought he could lie his way out of this, that the department would protect him like they always had. But now, as he approached the courthouse steps, he realized the truth. They were throwing him to the wolves. The officers escorting him didn't say a word. There was no solidarity, no sense of brotherhood. He was alone now, just like the chief had warned him. His hands were shackled, and his mind raced as he tried to figure out what had gone so wrong. Inside the courtroom, Michael stood tall as the judge entered. The room was packed with reporters, town officials, and a few familiar faces. Friends of his father, veterans who had stood by Jack throughout his life. They were here to see justice, and Michael was determined not to let them down. The judge cleared her throat, her voice echoing through the tense silence of the room. We are here to formally indict Officer Roy McDougal on charges of felonious assault, official misconduct, and violations of civil rights. The court will now proceed with the reading of the charges. As the charges were read aloud, Michael watched Roy's face closely. There was no fight left in him, no bravado. Roy sat motionless, his face pale, his eyes staring blankly ahead as the weight of the indictment pressed down on him. The evidence was overwhelming. The video footage, the witness testimonies, the internal reports that had been buried by the department, it was all out in the open now. There was no escaping it. When the judge finished, Roy's lawyer rose, looking resigned. "We waive the reading of the indictment, Your Honor," he said quietly. "My client understands the charges." The courtroom fell into a tense silence. All eyes were on Roy as he was led back out of the room, still in handcuffs. The formal indictment was done, and Roy McDougal would now face trial. There was no celebration, no cheering in the courtroom, just the somber reality of what had been done. But outside, it was a different story. The moment the news broke that Roy McDougal had been indicted, the crowd outside the courthouse erupted into cheers. For the first time in weeks, there was a glimmer of hope. Hope that justice could be served, that the system could be reformed, that the corruption that had allowed officers like Roy to operate with impunity would finally be dismantled. Michael Carter stepped outside the courthouse, standing on the steps as he addressed the crowd. The cameras turned toward him, the reporters leaning forward, waiting to capture his words. "This is just the beginning," Michael said, his voice calm but filled with resolve. "Officer Roy McDougal will face trial for his actions, and we will ensure that justice is served. But this is not just about one officer. This is about a system that allowed this to happen. A system that failed my father and failed this community." The crowd fell silent, listening intently. "We are conducting a full investigation into the police department's handling of complaints, and we will hold anyone who participated in the cover-up accountable. There will be reforms, there will be changes. This community deserves better, and we will not stop until those responsible for these failures are brought to justice." The crowd erupted again, cheers and applause filling the air. The fight wasn't over, but this was a victory, a step toward the justice they had been demanding. Back at the police station, Chief Green sat in his office, staring blankly at the wall. The files had been handed over, the cover-up exposed, and his role in protecting Roy McDougal had been laid bare. The department was in shambles, and the protests outside had become a daily reminder of how badly things had gone wrong. He knew his days were numbered. The investigation into the department was only going to get worse, and it was only a matter of time before he was forced to step down. Michael Carter's office had been relentless, uncovering every misstep, every failure, and now the department's reputation was in tatters. Green leaned back in his chair, the weight of his career pressing down on him. He had made his choices, and now he was paying the price. As Michael left the courthouse, his phone buzzed. It was the hospital. His heart sank as he answered. "Mr. Carter, it's about your father." Michael Carter's hands trembled slightly as he gripped his phone. The nurse on the other end of the line repeated herself, her voice gentle but firm. "Your father's condition has changed, Mr. Carter. You should come as soon as you can." For a moment, Michael stood frozen on the courthouse steps, his mind racing. Jack had been in a coma for weeks, and though his condition had stabilized, the doctors had warned him that things could change at any time. He had braced himself for this moment, but somehow felt completely unprepared. His car sped through the town as the streets blurred past him, the sounds of chanting protesters fading in the distance. The hospital loomed ahead, the same place. He had visited every day since the attack. Each time, Jack had been the same, still, quiet, unchanged. But now something was different. The nurses guided him to the familiar room. Jack lay there, motionless as always, the machines beeping rhythmically, keeping time with his shallow breaths. The doctor was waiting for him, his expression carefully neutral. "He's stable for now," but the doctor hesitated, then sighed. "His brain activity is minimal. If there's no improvement soon, you may need to consider your options." Michael's breath caught in his throat. The legal battles, the indictments, the reforms, All of it felt small in comparison to the fragility of life in this room. He had fought for justice, for accountability, but what about the person lying here? What about his father, the man who had raised him, taught him right from wrong, taught him to never back down? Michael sat at his father's side, the hum of the machines fading into the background. For the first time since the incident, he felt overwhelmed, not by the weight of his office or the expectations of justice, but by the very human grief of possibly losing his father. He hadn't said goodbye. He had spent so much time fighting the system, fighting for reform, that he hadn't made peace with the thought that Jack might never wake up. He squeezed his father's hand, his voice a low whisper. "I'm still fighting for you, Dad. We're getting justice, but I need you to come back. I need you here." The beeping of the machines remained steady, unchanged. Outside the hospital, the indictment of Roy McDougal continued to ripple through the town. The protests had grown even larger, but now they were filled with hope. Roy's trial was set, and the community believed, for the first time in a long while, that change was possible. But Michael knew that one indictment wasn't enough. His team had continued to dig into the police department's records, uncovering a pattern of systemic neglect that went back years. Officers with repeated complaints of racial bias, excessive force, and misconduct had been protected, shielded from consequences by the leadership. The entire department had operated on a culture of silence and complicity. Michael's legal team was already preparing to issue a report, one that would force the department to reckon with its failures. The chief had been exposed for his role in covering up misconduct, and the calls for his resignation were growing louder. The town was ready for change, and Michael was determined to deliver it. Several days later, the crowd gathered once again in front of the courthouse, this time for a different reason. The police chief, after days of mounting pressure, had finally announced his resignation. His departure was seen as a victory for the community, a sign that real change was beginning to take hold. Standing on the courthouse steps, Michael Carter addressed the crowd. He had kept his promises so far. Roy had been indicted, the chief had resigned, and the investigation into the department was continuing. But he knew the road ahead was long. The indictment of Officer McDougal and the resignation of Chief Green are steps toward justice, Michael said, his voice steady and resolute. But we are not done. My office is committed to overseeing the reform of this police department to ensure that this kind of corruption and misconduct can never happen again. The crowd cheered, the sense of triumph palpable, but Michael remained focused. He knew that justice wasn't just about punishing the guilty, it was about creating a system that was better, fairer, more just. As the crowd dispersed, a familiar figure approached Michael from the side of the steps. Sarah Thompson, one of the local civil rights activists, extended her hand. They had worked together in the weeks following the attack on Jack, and her leadership had been instrumental in organizing the protests and keeping the pressure on the department. "You did it, Michael," Sarah said, smiling softly. "You brought justice." Michael shook his head, his expression thoughtful. "We did it, and we've got a long way to go." She nodded, understanding the weight of his words. The community had fought hard, but there was still healing to be done. Later that evening, Michael returned to the hospital. The room was quiet, the machines still humming softly, the sterile smell of disinfectant filling the air. He sat by Jack's side once again, his heart heavy but a little lighter than before. He had done everything he could, everything his father had taught him to do, but the fight wasn't over, not yet. He looked at his father, his eyes tracing the familiar lines of his face, the deep wrinkles that spoke of a life lived through hardship and triumph. Jack had always been strong, but now, as Michael watched him lying there, still and silent, he realized that strength wasn't just in the fight, it was in the resilience that followed, the quiet determination to keep going, even when everything seemed lost. Michael leaned closer, his voice barely a whisper. "I know you're still in there, Dad. I know you're still fighting, and I'll keep fighting with you." For a long moment there was nothing but the soft beep of the monitors, and then, almost imperceptibly, Jack's fingers twitched. Michael froze, his heart leaping in his chest. The movement was slight, almost nothing, but it was there. Jack's eyelids fluttered, his breath hitching slightly as if his body was slowly waking from a deep sleep. Michael leaned closer, his pulse racing as he watched for any other signs of movement. The doctor rushed in, the nurses following close behind, but Michael barely noticed them. His eyes were locked on his father's hand, on the slight tremor that ran through his fingers. It was small. So small, but it was enough. Jack was still fighting. Over the next few days, Jack's condition slowly improved. He was far from fully recovered, but there was hope. Hope that he would wake. Hope that he would heal. And as Jack fought for his life, Michael continued to fight for justice. The trial of Roy McDougal loomed ahead. The investigation into the police department was underway, and the town was beginning to rebuild itself. The process of reform had begun, and though the road would be long, there was a sense that real, lasting change was possible. The town had been shaken, broken even, but from that brokenness, something new was emerging. A community that had seen the worst of its systems and was now committed to building something better. As Michael sat by his father's side, he reflected on the journey they had been through, the pain and the struggle. But he also saw the resilience, the determination to fight for a better future. And in that moment, as the sun set over the town, casting long shadows across the streets, Michael knew that justice was not just about the law. It was about healing, about standing up for what was right, and about creating a world where people like his father could live without fear. The road ahead was still uncertain, but Michael Carter knew one thing for sure: they were on the right path. If you enjoyed this story, give the video a like. What was your favorite part of the story? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this one.